So I'm going to leave the discussion about Canadian fiscal policy aside. That's outside my lane. What I do want to address is some of the other questions of alternatives and other things that you brought up, because that's really why we started Exposure. This is a complex issue, and we've never tried to oversimplify it. But complexity can't be an excuse for avoiding hard conversations and hard truths. The point of the show is to step back and look at the whole system, not just individual choices or products or facets of industry. There are low-hanging fruit. And so right off the bat, right out of the gate, you can focus there. One of the low-hanging fruit is single-use plastics. It's not a human necessity. In most cases, it's not even the best material. It's a convenience material, and convenience alone shouldn't be a defensible reason for exposing people to known health risks and for destroying the environment. There are existing alternatives like paper, aluminum, and glass. All of them have impacts at scale, but they are far less persistent in ecosystems. They generally pose fewer long-term risks to human health and the environment, and there are ways to sort of do them in more sustainable ways. So this isn't really like a binary choice between all plastic or no plastic, at least not at first. But this leads to a question, which is, why has plastic become the default for nearly everything, even when it clearly doesn't make sense? Reducing that demand is a reasonable first step, but stopping there lets the system that created the problem off the hook. What we've tried to show in the podcast is that this isn't just about consumer behavior. It's about structure and policy and law. Plastics are cheap largely because fossil fuels are heavily subsidized, directly and indirectly, through tax policy and infrastructure and spending and regulatory frameworks and the military-industrial complex and industrial agriculture. Those subsidies don't just lower prices, they shape entire markets. Petrochemicals are closely tied to oil and gas extraction, especially natural gas, fracking. And so keeping those chemical byproducts profitable helps sustain continued drilling and build out of natural gas and oil extraction. So the dominance of plastic isn't random or accidental. It's a predictable outcome of decades of energy and industrial policy that make fossil fuel-based materials artificially cost-advantaged while shifting health and environmental costs onto the public. So then this leads us to kind of a philosophical question, which is, what kind of economy do we actually want? And what are we willing to sacrifice to sustain it? Right now, all of our systems are built around perpetual growth models, which are not sustainable by the very nature of them is not sustainable. That's not, you don't need to be a tree-hugging hippie to say that. I mean, it is literally not possible to just grow endlessly in a finite world. And our systems are also built on externalizing costs, which are basically externalized harms that we treat as acceptable. And we have to decide whether we're comfortable with very real, very specific outcomes being treated as the price of doing business. Higher cancer rates, increased childhood leukemia, elevated asthma and respiratory diseases, the contamination of drinking water with endocrine disrupting or carcinogenic chemicals. Those aren't abstractions. Those are documented public health outcomes tied to these industries. If we wouldn't accept that trade-off in other places, why do we always accept it here? Transitions are disruptive by nature, but disruption alone can't be the reason that we avoid change. We don't get to call harm inevitable just because it's profitable. None of this is really inevitable. All of this is built on a legacy of choices. Every major shift in history has involved disruption. The real question is, what are the costs that we're paying by not disrupting the status quo? One quick note on China, just because you brought it up, and it comes up a lot when you're discussing like what we should be doing in the United States as far as renewable energies or whatever. And regardless of your politics or whatever you think about China, the fact is that China is currently deploying solar, wind, battery storage, and grid infrastructure at a scale that no other industrial country is matching. That doesn't make them a model for everything, but it does show that rapid energy transition is technically and economically possible without completely disrupting the whole country. On the idea of energy security, which you brought up, as long as fuels are globally traded, no country is ever truly energy independent. As long as we are exporting and importing energy, we are always going to be susceptible to the price shocks and the supply disruptions and the geopolitical leverage that are built into that global system. Countries like Norway have done more to sort of insulate themselves from that, but that's because the state owns their largest oil companies. And they've made sure that their citizens are receiving a lot of benefit for those activities and those extractions, right? They treat their natural resources as finite and as a public good. The result is that you have a nation that looks more like what you would expect an energy independent nation to look like, where they're not only insulated from the global market, but they're also receiving a lot of benefit from their energy companies. That's how they pay for a lot of their social programs and things. On renewable energy, yes, there are very real issues with renewable energy, and not every so-called green solution actually solves anything. Some of them are just sort of shell games for the oil and gas industry. But solar and wind themselves are not the issue. The biggest failure we see today comes from deploying them with the same extraction-first mindset as fossil fuels, clearing forests or destroying farmland instead of using rooftops and brownfield sites and already developed land. That's not a technology failure. There's nothing inherent about the technology of solar that says we have to do it that way. That's a policy and a business model failure. So, those are just some thoughts sort of off the top of my head to respond to some of the things that you said. I appreciate the thoughtful question. These are the exact kind of conversations that we're trying to have. When we started Exposure, this kind of back and forth was one of the things that we had in mind. We wanted to be able to really talk about these industries and technologies, energy, these issues in a way that was detached from sort of the slogans and the politics and everything. So thanks for watching and commenting.